10 of the most interesting things you didn't know about the Apollo space missions. Hey there, space fans! Think you know everything about the Apollo moon missions? Well, buckle up. We've got 10 mind-blowing Apollo facts you probably didn't know. The Apollo program had surprises hidden behind every corner, from wild technical tricks to quirky personal stories. Ready to blast off from number 10 down to number 1? Let's go! Number 10. The Saturn V rocket had otherworldly power and fuel consumption to match. Let's start big, literally. The Apollo missions rode into space atop the Saturn V rocket, a behemoth still unmatched in sheer power. Standing 363 feet tall, about a 36-story building, and weighing 6.2 million pounds fully fueled, the Saturn V could really throw its weight around. At launch, its first stage's 5 F1 engines produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust, more power than 85 Hoover dams could generate. In terms of energy, that's enough to light up New York City for over an hour. The sound alone was so intense it rattled buildings miles away. All that power came with a voracious appetite. The Saturn V burned about 15 tons of fuel per second in the first stage. Imagine draining a backyard swimming pool in seconds. That's how quickly it guzzled rocket fuel, which is essentially a refined kerosene and liquid oxygen. In the roughly 2.5 minutes that the first stage fired, it lifted the Apollo spacecraft to about 38 miles high and then dropped off, having done its job. The Saturn V remains the heaviest and most capable rocket ever to successfully fly. No wonder it's often called one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements. Number 9. The Apollo Guidance Computer, minimal specs, maximum impact. Believe it or not, the computer that guided Apollo astronauts to the moon had less processing power than a modern toaster. Okay, slight exaggeration, but your smartphone is millions of times more powerful. The Apollo Guidance Computer, or simply the AGC, had only about 36 kilobytes of read-only memory and operated at a speed of roughly 0.043 megahertz. Yet this little computer was a technological marvel for its time. It was one of the first to use integrated circuits, and it was incredibly reliable. One fascinating aspect is how its programs were stored. The AGC's software was literally woven into core rope memory by hand. Teams of skilled women, whom engineers jokingly nicknamed little old ladies, threaded wires through magnetic cores to represent the ones and zeros of the code. If the wire went through the tiny ferrite core, it was a 1. If it went around, a 0. This labor-intensive process produced highly robust memory, basically a form of read-only memory that was nearly fail-safe. NASA hired women from textile mills and even watchmakers for their precision, and the painstaking work paid off with software that never failed in flight. The software itself was ahead of its time. In fact, the term software engineering was popularized by Apollo's lead programmer, Margaret Hamilton. Hamilton's team programmed the AGC to handle multiple tasks by priority and to recover gracefully from overloads. Good thing they did, because during Apollo 11's lunar descent, the computer faced an unexpected torrent of data from a radar left on at the wrong time and began throwing 1201 and 1202 program alarms. Instead of crashing or steering them wrong, the AGC smartly shed non-essential tasks and reallocated resources, basically saying, I'll drop what I don't need and focus on the landing. This allowed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to continue the descent safely. The Apollo Guidance Computer may have been primitive by today's standards, but its ingenious design and code literally saved the mission. Number 8. Spacesuits sewn by bra makers. You might think the Apollo spacesuits, those white suits that kept astronauts alive on the moon, were built by high-tech aerospace contractors in sterile labs. Surprise! They were actually hand-sewn by a team of skilled seamstresses, many of whom previously sewed bras and girdles for Playtex. Yes, that Playtex. In the 1960s, NASA commissioned the International Latex Corporation, Playtex's parent company, to design the lunar spacesuit after other contractors' designs proved too bulky and rigid. The Playtex team proposed a radical idea, a flexible, layered fabric suit, essentially a tailored garment. instead of a hard-shell suit. These seamstresses, who are definitely the unsung heroes of Apollo, worked with incredible precision. Each Apollo suit had 21 layers of specialized fabric, and every stitch had to be perfect, within 1/64th of an inch. One misplaced stitch or stray needle could mean a leak or a tear that could be fatal. The pressure was literally life or death, and the women knew it. They often worked long hours and sometimes went home in tears from the stress, but their craftsmanship was extraordinary. Not a single Apollo moonwalk suit failed. To test the suits, engineers made the seamstresses do things like football drills while wearing them. There's footage of a Playtex employee doing jumping jacks and kicks in a prototype suit. The final suits were so reliable that Neil Armstrong once called them mini spacecraft. Each one was a self-contained life support system. So when you see those iconic images of astronauts bouncing on the moon, remember the human touch behind that technology. A group of talented women with sewing machines, whose expertise in lingerie helped make lunar exploration possible. Number 7. A simple pen saved Apollo 11's moonwalkers. Walking on the moon is great, but getting off the moon is pretty important too. During Apollo 11, after their historic moonwalk, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin faced a scary situation inside the lunar module Eagle. While moving around in their bulky suits, a circuit breaker switch that armed the ascent engine, the engine needed to launch them back off the moon, got accidentally broken off. In Aldrin's words, he had been wearing his backpack and banged into the circuit breaker, and that was the one that controlled the engine ignition. If they couldn't activate that switch, they would be stranded on the lunar surface with no way to get home. Talk about a bad day on the moon? Mission Control was notified, but there was no quick fix from Earth. The astronauts had already dumped most of their tools to lighten the craft, preparing for liftoff. So what did they do? Buzz Aldrin came up with a MacGyver-style solution. He grabbed a felt-tip pen, basically a simple plastic pen, and used it to push in the circuit breaker into the panel where the toggle switch had broken off. That completed the electrical circuit. With fingers crossed, they activated the switch with the pen, and it worked. Houston confirmed they had a good circuit. The ascent engine fired, and Eagle lifted off the moon to rejoin Mike Collins in orbit. That ordinary pen became the unsung hero of Apollo 11. It was just a Duro brand felt-tip marker, but it was in the right place at the right time. In fact, that very pen and the broken switch are now museum artifacts celebrated for saving the Apollo 11 mission. It's a great reminder that in space exploration, sometimes little things make a huge difference, and creative problem solving is part of the astronaut job description. Number 6. Apollo 12 was struck by lightning and saved by a young engineer. In November 1969, Apollo 12 launched into cloudy, stormy skies, which turned out to be a shocking decision. 36 seconds after liftoff, the Saturn V rocket was struck by lightning. Twice. The entire command module's electrical systems went haywire, lights flashing, alarms sounding, instruments going dead. On board, astronaut Pete Conrad exclaimed, "What the hell was that?" as the spacecraft lost its guidance platform and telemetry. It looked like Apollo 12 might have to abort before reaching orbit. Down in mission control, nobody immediately knew what to do. Nobody except a 24-year-old flight controller named John Aaron. A year earlier, Aaron had seen a similar bizarre telemetry pattern during a simulation, and he remembered the obscure fix. He quickly called out the now famous instruction, "Try SCE to aux." This referred to a very little-known switch that meant signal conditioning equipment to auxiliary power. In other words, switch the electronics to a backup power source that could handle low-voltage conditions. Most folks in mission control were scratching their heads. SCE to what? Even the flight director wasn't sure what he meant. But astronaut Alan Bean aboard Apollo 12 did remember where that SCE switch was. He later said it was a lucky thing he'd seen that switch during training. Bean flipped it to aux. Instantly, the telemetry readings came back to normal. The instruments revived, guidance was restored, and Apollo 12 continued on its way to the moon as if nothing had happened. The crew even joked, "I think we need to do a little more all-weather testing," after things calmed down. John Aaron's quick thinking earned him the honored title of a steely-eyed missile man in NASA lore. If he hadn't remembered that arcane workaround, Apollo 12 likely would have been aborted, and who knows how the moon race might have changed. Instead, Pete Conrad and Alan Bean went on to have a successful mission, complete with some fun antics we'll talk about soon. Apollo 12's lightning incident is a legendary example of Apollo-era ingenuity under pressure. Next time you're caught in a storm, just be glad you're not riding a 30-story rocket through it. Number 5. The strange things Apollo astronauts left on the moon. The Apollo astronauts didn't just take things to the moon. They left a bunch of stuff there too, ranging from the practical to the poignant to the, well, gross. For starters, going to the moon is all about weight management. Every pound matters, especially when you have to launch back home. To offset the weight of moon rocks they wanted to bring back, the Apollo crews dumped a lot of unneeded items on the lunar surface. This included tools, cameras, boots, and trash. In fact, across all the missions, 96 bags of human waste were left on the moon. It's a little icky to think about, but those sealed bags are still up there at the landing sites. And maybe even grosser, scientists actually wouldn't mind checking them someday for any hardy microbes to see if Earth bacteria could survive dormant in the harsh lunar environment. But it's not all waste and litter. Apollo missions left some pretty meaningful artifacts on the moon. Apollo 11 left behind the famous U.S. flag, which, fun fact, was knocked over by the blast of the ascent engine when Armstrong and Aldrin took off. They also left a plaque that says, "We came in peace for all mankind." Subsequent missions left their own flags and mission patches. One of the most touching things left on the moon is the fallen astronaut memorial from Apollo 15. Astronaut Dave Scott secretly brought a small 3-inch aluminum sculpture of an astronaut and placed it on the ground alongside a plaque with 14 names of American and Soviet spacefarers who had died. It's the first art installation on the moon and a memorial to heroes. Apollo 15's crew also left a Bible on the dashboard of their lunar rover, and astronaut James Irwin said a prayer. Apollo 16's Charlie Duke left a family photo on the moon, a portrait of him, his wife, and kids sealed in plastic. He took a photo of it lying in the lunar dust, though the relentless sunlight has likely bleached it blank by now. Apollo 17's Gene Cernan and Jack Schmitt left a geologic sampling station and drove the last lunar rover to a distant parking spot. And every mission left behind the base of the lunar module, the landing stage, as well as experiment packages like seismic sensors and laser reflectors that scientists still use today. Oh, and let's not forget the 2 golf balls that Apollo 14's Alan Shepard drove across the lunar surface. More on that next. The moon has become a bit of a time capsule of the late 1960s and early 70s, scattered with mementos of humanity's first visits. If future explorers ever pick up those items, they'll have quite the museum collection. Just bring some gloves if you decide to retrieve the 50-year-old poop bags. Number 4. The one and only lunar golf tournament. It's hard to imagine a sport more opposite of golf than rocket science. Yet Apollo managed to put golf on the moon. During Apollo 14 in 1971, astronaut Alan Shepard, the first American in space and the mission commander, couldn't resist pulling a little stunt. He had secretly smuggled on board a makeshift 6-iron golf club head and a couple of golf balls. During the mission's second moonwalk, after all the official tasks were done, Shepard pulled out the club head, attached it to the handle of a lunar sampling tool, and announced he was going to hit a couple of balls. In the 1/6 gravity of the moon, with a clumsy spacesuit restricting his movement, Shepard took a one-handed swing. He whiffed the first attempt, kicking up only dust. But on the second swing, he managed to hit the ball, sort of a shank as he later described. The ball dribbled into a nearby crater. Determined, Shepard dropped a second ball. This time he connected better, and the ball sailed off in the weak lunar gravity. With virtually no air resistance, a golf ball can really fly on the moon. Shepard joked that it went miles and miles and miles, which got a good laugh. In reality, later analysis of video footage suggests it went maybe a few hundred yards, still the farthest golf shot not on Earth. Meanwhile, crewmate Ed Mitchell threw a makeshift javelin, a staff they'd been using, as a little Olympic-style event. Mitchell's javelin and Shepard's second golf ball landed near each other, which they proudly pointed out to their mission control umpires. This light-hearted moment became an iconic bit of Apollo lore. Imagine, in the midst of one of humanity's most daring endeavors, they took a minute to play a round of zero-handicap golf. It showed the world that astronauts were not just high-strung test pilots, but humans who could have fun and make history at the same time. The club head and suit attachment Shepard used are now in the USGA Golf Museum, and photos of the event, though grainy, have been remastered to trace the ball's flight. To this day, those two golf balls remain on the moon at Framaro Highlands, probably sitting in the dust near that small crater. Lunar golfers, anyone? Number 3. Apollo 10's Wild Ride. Snoopy and the fastest humans ever. Apollo 11 gets all the fame for the first landing, but Apollo 10, in May 1969, was the dress rehearsal that did everything but actually land on the moon. And it had its own share of amazing fun facts. For one, the crew named their spacecraft after Peanuts characters. The command module was Charlie Brown, and the lunar module was Snoopy. The idea was that Snoopy would snoop around the moon for a landing site. Apollo 10 went down to about 15 kilometers, 47,000 feet, above the lunar surface. So close, yet so far. NASA deliberately did not fill Snoopy's fuel tank all the way to ensure the crew couldn't give in to temptation and try an unauthorized landing. Astronauts are bold folk after all. They needed to come back and report everything for Apollo 11. During that close approach, things got harrowing. As Snoopy's lunar module ascent stage was about to rejoin the command module, a wrong switch setting caused it to start gyrating out of control. Eugene Cernan and Tom Stafford suddenly found their lunar module wildly tumbling, instruments spinning. Cernan swore on an open mic before they managed to regain control after a few heart-stopping seconds. They humorously reported, "We've got all our marbles," after recovering. That was probably the closest call on Apollo until Apollo 13's crisis. It showed just how quickly things could go from routine to white-knuckle in space. After finishing their tasks, the Apollo 10 crew jettisoned Snoopy's ascent stage. Unlike other lunar modules, which were sent to crash on the moon, Snoopy was sent into a heliocentric solar orbit. Basically, Snoopy is still out there orbiting the sun to this day. In fact, decades later, astronomers believe they may have spotted Snoopy's derelict module drifting in space, and there's talk of possibly retrieving it in the future. It's the only piece of human spacecraft that's been lost in space in solar orbit with no specific destination. Kind of poetic, isn't it? Apollo 10 also set a record that still stands. The crew became the fastest humans in history. On the return to Earth, they reached a re-entry speed of nearly 39,900 kilometers per hour, or approximately 24,791 miles per hour. That's about Mach 32 relative to Earth's atmosphere, the highest speed ever attained by humans. When you hear someone say, "We're going to need warp speed," remember Apollo 10 basically did it, by human standards. The mission proved all the pieces for the lunar landing, and its success gave NASA the confidence to send Apollo 11 to glory. Plus, we got these fun stories of Snoopy, Charlie Brown, and record-breaking speeds as a bonus. Number 2, astronaut pranks and humor. Playboy and a $500 bet. The Apollo astronauts were serious about their jobs, but they also had legendary senses of humor. Apollo 12 in particular was a rollicking mission full of pranks. The crew, Pete Conrad, Al Bean, and Dick Gordon, were pranksters, aided and abetted by the backup crew, guys like Dave Scott and Jim Irwin, who later flew Apollo 15. One famous prank: without the Apollo 12 crew knowing, the backup team slipped Playboy centerfold photos into the astronauts' lunar surface checklists. These checklists were little spiral books on their suit cuffs with to-do lists for the moonwalk. Scattered among the pages, the backup crew had pasted in mini Playmate pinups, with goofy captions related to geology and exploring mountains and craters, of course. So there you have Al Bean, busy on the moon doing science, when he flips a page and suddenly Miss December 1969, Cynthia Myers, is looking back at him wearing only a Santa hat. Bean hopped over to show Pete Conrad, who had his own surprises, 2 different Playmates in his checklist. The astronauts howled with laughter inside their suits. They wisely kept it off the radio. We didn't say anything on the air, Bean later recalled, since they figured public reveal of Playboy pics on the moon might cause a stir. But they had a great laugh, and even years later they joked about the first gentleman's magazine on the moon. In fact, one of the hidden photos was accidentally captured on camera. In a famous picture of Pete Conrad on the moon, you can just barely see part of a pinup on his wrist checklist if you know where to look. So yes, a Playboy playmate made it to the moon, in picture form, and got photographed there. Another classic bit of Apollo humor happened the moment Pete Conrad became the third man to step onto the moon. Conrad was shorter than Neil Armstrong and known as a jokester. Before the mission, an Italian journalist, Oriana Fallaci, bet Conrad $500 that astronauts were instructed what to say on the moon. She doubted a pilot like Armstrong came up with one giant leap by himself. Conrad took that bet, so on November 19, 1969, when he hopped off the ladder, Pete Conrad exclaimed, "Whoopee! Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me," referencing his own shorter height and playfully mocking the grand words of Armstrong. It was totally off the cuff and proved NASA wasn't scripting astronaut speeches. Conrad later joked that unfortunately, Fallaci never paid up the $500. The Apollo missions had plenty of these human moments. The crews carried zero-G jokes, snuck personal items on board. John Young on Apollo 16 even snuck a corned beef sandwich into space during Gemini 3, but that's another story. And often the banter on the NASA transcripts is pure gold. They knew when to be test pilots and when to lighten the mood. After all, if you can't have a laugh while flying to the moon, when can you? And finally, number 1. Apollo 11's nail-biter landing was almost forced to abort. It's hard to top all these stories, but perhaps the most white-knuckle moment of any Apollo mission, one many people don't realize, was the final descent of Apollo 11. The world watched Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descend towards the moon on July 20th, 1969. But few knew just how close it came to failing in those last minutes. There were multiple problems. First, remember those computer alarms we mentioned back in number 9? During the landing, Eagle's computer threw 5 separate 1201 and 1202 alarms due to overflow. Each time it had to reboot and juggle tasks. If the alarms had continued, Neil Armstrong might have had to abort the landing. Thankfully, Mission Control, with guidance from engineers like Steve Bales and Jack Garman, analyzed the alarm codes in real time and gave the go to proceed each time, trusting the computer was handling it. Then as Armstrong looked outside, he realized Eagle was headed toward a boulder field on the moon. Not a safe place to set down. The automatic targeting was off, partly due to a navigation error that dropped them long of the intended site. So Armstrong took manual control. He leveled off and flew the lunar module like a helicopter, searching for a clear spot, all while the clock was ticking on their fuel supply. Back in Houston, controllers saw the fuel readings dropping fast as Armstrong flew over craters looking for a safe landing. A call of 60 seconds, then 30 seconds of fuel remaining came up. After that, they'd have to abort or risk crashing. In reality, due to fuel slosh and sensor quirks, they had a bit more than it appeared. But at the time, Mission Control thought they had only 17 seconds of fuel left when Eagle finally landed. Moments later, Armstrong's calm voice announced, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." The room erupted in cheers and relief. Later analysis showed there was maybe 45 seconds of fuel in the tank on touchdown, but much of that might not have been usable due to sloshing. It was an incredibly tight margin. If Armstrong had hovered just a few seconds longer, or if those alarms had spooked them, history might have been very different. Armstrong's cool-headed piloting under pressure and the computer's reliable priority system, shout out again to Margaret Hamilton's team, ensured that Apollo 11 succeeded by the skin of its teeth. As they say, nothing worth doing is easy. Apollo 11's landing was a triumph of skill, technology, and yes, some luck. Now that you know the intense backstory, the Eagle has landed carries even more weight. It wasn't just a routine touchdown. It was a victory snatched from the jaws of potential failure. And that makes the Apollo accomplishment all the more extraordinary. Those are 10 fascinating things you might not have known about the Apollo missions. From rockets shaking the ground like no other, to computers with woven memories, to astronauts goofing off with golf clubs and Playboy pics, the journey to the moon was filled with human touches and high drama. The Apollo program was a complex tapestry of engineering genius, bold adventurers, and countless unsung contributors who made impossible dreams come true. Houston, signing off, and as always, keep looking up, at the moon perhaps, and stay curious.